Yes, hello.
Okay, I think we're all ready to start. So sit back, relax. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Janet Bahima of Herzog Fox Ne'eman. It's great to see we've got over 60 people, so I think that's a nice quorum to get started. Hope you can all hear. A couple of rules of the game in case any of you haven't been spending.
Sorry, I can't hear.
You can't
Hello?
hear.
I can hear you now. Sorry, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So just a couple rules of the game in case anyone has not been spending way too much time on Zoom calls over the last few months. When you're not speaking, please make sure you are on mute. Otherwise you take over the screen and things like that. If you do want to speak, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up, or we also have a chat box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you can send messages then to the whole group, or you can send messages then to individual people. For example, if you have questions, you can always put them in the chat box while people are speaking, so you don't forget, okay? I'm Janet Bahima from Herzog Fox Ne'eman. We are the largest law firm in Israel, and besides doing international corporate transactions, what might be more interesting for this event is that I run our impact investment practice area. That has led to collaboration with SID, the Society for International Development, and the Ministry of Economy and other partners in our series, Destination Africa, Continent of Tomorrow. Our series has brought us together over the last 3 years as we explored opportunities and challenges and partnerships. And this is great to see that Destination Africa is now going both virtual and to the West. So we hope there's an opportunity for a lot of people from far places that might not have been able to join us in the past to join us for our webinar today. Now, in our series, we've looked at the African continent from different perspectives. We've seen case studies in Kenya. We've heard about Israeli connections. We've heard from authors of Make Africa Work. And we devoted a conference to doing business in Ethiopia. But this is going to be our first conference on West Africa. With the halt of travel, with lockdowns, with restrictions, like so many challenges, there can also be opportunities. And we hope this webinar is a great example. So let's get started. Alon Be'er, head of SID Israel, please take over.
So thank you, Janet, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And as Janet mentioned, this forum is an ongoing cooperation that already created very interesting opportunities to discuss a very nice title of Africa, the Continent of Tomorrow. And we are happy that we have a chance to focus, although in a large area, but in an area in the African continent. For those of you who don't know us, so we are an umbrella organization with over 150 members who are coming from the civil society, the private sector, government agencies, and academic programs that are actively working in the fields of humanitarian aid or international development. When our mission is to encourage Israeli involvement and action in emerging markets through economic and humanitarian work. And this is also a great opportunity to invite those of you who are not members in our community to join us. The series, as Janet mentioned, is really a meeting point for professionals that are doing business in Africa, and an informal platform to share lessons, to foster collaboration, to develop new initiatives, and to explore the potential opportunities and challenges in fields such as agriculture, water, and energy. These days, we are working to bring together knowledge and experience and to understand the situation and needs on the ground following the COVID-19 outbreak. And as always, with crisis, it brings with him some opportunities. As an organization that promotes international cooperation, this pandemic is in a way a good example of the fact that we live in a global world in which problems are not staying far away, and we feel obliged to take action and facilitate the way through for Israeli firms and organizations. We also know that there is a great opportunity for out-of-the-box thinking and vast cooperation to bring innovation to the developing world. And we are privileged to have with us a lot of senior representatives from different sectors, and I'm sure it will be a fruitful discussion. So I wish us all a lot of success and outcomes from the ongoing, for the upcoming meeting today. Thank you, and I think Noah will take the floor now.
Thank you, Alon. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Alon and Janet for this great introduction, and also for hosting this interesting webinar. Without further ado, I would like to present our panelists for today. We are joined by Mr. Anthony Haas, Regional Director of the Francophone countries in West Africa from the Tony Blair Institution for Global Change. Mr. Yofi Grant, the CEO of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center. Mr. Edward Afua, the Chairman of the Fidelity Bank. And Ms. Ayelet Levin-Karp, the Head of the Trade and Economic Mission in Ghana. For the next 45 minutes, we will hear from the professionals, the people with their boots on the ground. What is happening in Africa? What are the trends? And what would be our next steps as the global community of business and economy? So I would like to please address all the panelists, starting with Mr. Grant. Please introduce yourself shortly, your organization, and your personal perspective regarding the COVID-19. You should unmute yourself.
I keep forgetting always. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet all of you, and good to see that we're all well and good. My name is Yofi Grant, and I understand that Yofi in Hebrew means beautiful, and that's exactly what I am. And it's a pleasure to meet all of you. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Ghana Investment Promotion Center under the Presidency of Ghana, and we are the National Investment Promotion Agency, IPA, which is tasked with promoting, facilitating, attracting foreign direct investment in partnership with indigenous direct investment into the Ghana economy. I work with the president, I work with the foreign minister, I work with the Ministry of Finance, and so it's an exciting job full of prospects. I come from a background of investment banking in Ghana and West Africa. I think that COVID-19, which I'd call a force majeure incident, has actually come to disrupt our lives in a way that we can reconstruct for a better future. And the unfortunate collateral damage of people losing their lives, etc., should make us all commit that we can create a better future for all humanity. And for me, the impact on West Africa has been significant. Firstly, because most of our economies are predicated on the export of raw materials and resources and are commodities driven. And in a time when trade has been disrupted, value chains have been disrupted, logistics have been disrupted, borders have been closed, communities have been shut down in lockdowns. It's affected first the whole trade value chain. It has affected productivity and production. It has affected consumption. And even more significant is the fact that most of our economies in West Africa are SMEs and SMIs. We describe them as SMEs and SMIs, and so are farmers. And so the impact has been severe. The impact has also been very severe in the social component of our lives, because Africans by nature really congregate. You can go to a family house and easily find 20 people there. And they live and we do a lot of stuff in close proximity. We are very cultural, so there's a lot of culture in our lives. you hardly will go through a day without speaking to at least 20 people or engaging 20 people, either your family or your work staff or people who just come through. So with the COVID-19 and lockdowns and closure of borders to make sure that people are safe and sound, and the quarantines and all that, it's really disrupted our lives. But perhaps the most unspoken part of it that has affected almost everybody is the psychological part of it, that we live in a world where we communicate and we engage. And to come to a time where for 3 months we've had to disengage just to keep safe, I believe has had significant psychological impact on almost everybody. But it has also reset the clock on how we look at ourselves and how we look at the future. So in West Africa, which is mainly oil producing, gold producing, minerals producing, with the collapse of the oil prices, it means that we've had to re-engineer our economies to rely more on value addition to our own commodities and creating internal markets, not only in our countries, but on the continent. And that means that also energizing the small and medium-sized enterprises and individual businesses to take over import substitution and get into production. And because in Ghana, we are also an agricultural nation, we have embarked on a massive agricultural program called Planting for Food and Jobs, where there's a lot of investment going to go into agriculture. There's a lot of government support going to go into agriculture for food security. We've also embarked on a significant program called One District, One Factory, where each of our 260 districts would have a manufacturing facility to create jobs and to create opportunity nationwide, not just in the urban areas. But then we are also working on a very powerful maxim of Ghana Beyond Aid, where we are selling to the foreign investor that we are no more interested in handouts and gifts and pass-ons, etc., but we are more interested in partnerships and linkages and in trade and investment. And we look at investment as a relationship. And so we build our marketing and our execution on that relationship. We are hoping that we will see the end of COVID-19 before the end of the year. But if it goes on beyond to the end of the year, some of the projections that have been made are definitely going to be trumped. For example, Sub-Saharan African growth projection prior to COVID was, this is by the IMF and the World Bank, was 3.1%. Pre-COVID, it went up to 3.6%. And now with the COVID 2020 projection, we're expecting it to be minus 1.6%. In ECOWAS, pre-COVID and in 2019, it was 3.6. We expect that 2020 to go up to 3.8. But during the COVID projection is now a minus 1.4. But the Ghana story tells a little bit of a different scenario where in 2019, our GDP growth was 6.5 and our pre-COVID projection was 6.8. And now with COVID, we are looking between 1.5% to 2.5%. Indeed, I must emphasize that over the past 3 years, the Ghana economy has been projected by the World Bank and the IMF as one of the world's fastest growing economies on the back of economic rationalization, significant reforms, better care for the public purse, and a real fiscal consolidation to ensure that the budget is kept in check with a fiscal law and a fiscal rule that says that we can't spend more than 5% of our GDP. And so we believe that economic stability is important. We are building the economy for resilience, irreversibility, and sustainability in its growth. But we are also engaging in significant reforms at the investment end to make Ghana much more attractive to the investor, not just for the investor, for a foreign investor, but for the indigenous investor, and create what in our minds in the medium term should be the best place to do business in Africa. So all in all, we really look forward to seeing the back of COVID-19. We believe that all the interventions that most of the governments are making, for example, Burkina Faso had a 394 billion CFA emergency plan. Senegal is also going to do a 69 billion CFA plan for food distribution out of a fund called the Force COVID-19 Fund, which is endowed with 1,000 billion CFA. Ghana also has gotten a $1 billion fund, $1 billion support for COVID-19. And Nigeria has promised a 500 billion naira corona fund. We believe that post-COVID, some countries will be more resilient than others. But what you'd notice in West Africa is a common growth model based on domestic consumption, a healthy local private sector, and relatively robust agricultural sectors. I mean, when you come to West Africa, most of the economies are dominated by the private sector. We believe that the two areas where we see a resurgence in the global supply chain from this perspective, the African perspective, is in agriculture, because Africa still has close to 60% of the remaining arable land left in the world. And so the potential for also feeding the world is there. And I think there's an opportunity for African nations and investors to take advantage during COVID and post-COVID to get back to the restoration of our economies. The areas that have had the most challenge, especially in Ghana and West Africa, is in the hospitality and tourism sector, where almost all hotels have been closed. And that's really affected tourism because airports are closed, travel banned across many borders to curb the COVID-19 thing. So that is also an area that I expect that post-COVID there will be significant opportunity. Trade and industry has also been significantly disrupted, given that most of our West African countries are import-driven economies. And so a lot of our international trade and reserves have been affected significantly with shutdowns, quarantines, and all that. The negative impact of that will mean a shortage of forex due to investor capital flight and decrease in exports and a slowdown in investments. And then, of course, the last significant part that has been affected is the oil and gas sector, where we've seen oil prices collapse. I mean, I can give you some detail where Ghana set a benchmark price of $59.66 of the price per barrel for 2020. And because of the drop in oil prices, our oil revenue target is expected to drop by 53% for this year. I think there's a lot of opportunity that is open between West Africa and Israel in many ways, especially in the agri front. I think that is where there's going to be a significant part of it, because the West Africa market is probably one of the world's fastest growing middle class, has one of the fastest growing middle class. By 2050, Africa's growth is expected to account for over 50% of the world's population growth. In fact, by 2050, Africa will have 1/4 of the world's population. 1 in 4 will be an African. And so there's a lot of opportunity that one needs to look at, either as the Africans as a growing market or as a source of labor support. But agriculture will play a significant role in attracting investment into the continent. So I think that for Israel, it's a win-win proposition coming to West Africa, because West Africa is also probably the fastest growing region in Africa as of now. And if you look at the 10 fastest growing countries in the world over the past 10 years, 6 of them have been from Africa. About three of them have been from West Africa. So I believe that the opportunity is ripe now. And the relationship between Israel spans many years, straight from the 50s through to the 60s, where the agricultural cooperatives that were set up in Ghana, the youth training programs, the medical infrastructure, and a number of joint enterprises in West African countries were from Israel. And you find that these companies operated through Ghana, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and amongst others. We believe that a good way for you to start is to look at a cooperation with ECOWAS and look at technology transfer between Israeli companies and West African countries, and trade facilitation, especially with the advent of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and where the Secretariat is actually located in Accra, would be a good place to start. So I think I will stop here and take any questions that you may have, if there's any specific request that you want. We would.
Thank you very much, Mr. Grant. We will continue with the follow-up questions once we finish the panel towards the end. So guys, if you have anything to ask Mr. Grant, please refer to him at the chat, and we will get back to your question later. Before we continue, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of our Israeli ambassador in Ghana, Ms. Jennifer Zavadia. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see you guys at the office in Accra. I would like to give the stage now to Mr. Anthony Haas. We would love to hear your perspective, especially from a person coming from a governmental strategy point of view. So please take it from here.
Hi, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. So I'm Antoine Haas. I'm with the Tony Blair Institute. I'm the regional director for projects in Francophone West Africa, currently sitting in London, but I used to sit in many West African capitals in the past. TBI is a non-for-profit organization working at the intersection of the public and the private sector, headed by the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. And so we combine both sort of technical management support as well as sort of the political understanding of the sort of imperatives that head of states and government have to deal with in implementing their strategies. We're currently working across 15 countries in Africa, 10 of which are in West Africa. So our footprint and knowledge of the region is quite substantial. And our value proposition really is about improving the effectiveness of government as a key sort of stakeholder in creating the condition for inclusive growth and human capital development. And we work both in offices of presidents or prime minister, as well as in key ministries and agencies such as the Ghana Investment Promotion Centers and others, IPAs across the region. And we rely on the leadership of people like Yofi, as you've heard. And so we really work shoulder to shoulder with government to promote the government agenda. So I'll just very quickly sort of talk about some of the things we were working pre-COVID in the region. And I think it's important because I think COVID both exacerbates some of the trends but also makes some of the opportunities even clearer. So we worked a lot on energy, infrastructure and trade. As you know, access to electricity across the continent is a challenge. But there are many potentials. We work, for instance, on hydropower in Guinea, which is developing large dams. We're working closely with the government of Senegal, which is sort of developing recent discovery of gas, natural gas, and Burkina Faso, which has a huge potential in solar energy. And we've also done some analysis that shows that actually mutually beneficial trade within the region within ECOWAS could save up to $32 billion over the next 10 years with better trade between the utility companies and regional countries. We work a lot also on agro-processing, and with Africa importing up to $80 billion worth of food every year, this is clearly, as it was identified earlier, a major area for growth. And we worked, for instance, with the government of Ghana to export fresh cut fruits to the UK and Cote d'Ivoire on cotton and cashew, mangoes in Togo, rice in Sierra Leone. There is plenty of opportunities in that sector. And similarly, in the manufacturing sector, Africa imports over $300 billion worth of manufacturing goods every year. And we work in the region in particular, again, with Ghana on its ambitious automotive sector development strategy, as well as other countries in the region that have a potential for developing a textile and garment industry akin to the ones you've seen in East Africa, but with even a premium quality cotton and a closer proximity to some of the US and European markets. And we've also worked a bit on services and supported countries like Togo, which was very sort of proactive in developing a commercial offer on the business process outsourcing, the call centers, which didn't exist before, and which has been driven partly by government vision and leadership, including also some of the doing business reforms that have led the country to jump 40 ranks in the last World Bank's ranking. And then COVID. Africa was very fast in West African government, as Yofi mentioned, to put in place travel restriction, contain mitigations measures, lockdown, testing, and they're currently in the process now of reopening their economies gradually and with the right adjustments. And so far the numbers are still relatively low, but of course we should not be complacent. And we should be clear that the economic impact is likely going to be quite big. And in fact, that's partly why the countries are reopening, is because the cure could actually be more damaging than the disease. And we have to accept for Africa that there's a delayed wave compared to the rest of the world. And we also, unfortunately, lack data and testing capacity. Although, again, I'm using Yofi on the panel to sort of emphasize that Ghana has been quite exemplary in this regard. I won't go into the growth prospects. I think these were mentioned, largely driven by some of the dependence on commodity prices and the slowdown in Europe and China. But I think also some of the constraints that are going to limit the region's response is also a low tax base, limited fiscal space, and a very important informal sector with over 80% of employment and large youth demographics. Although we are seeing innovative cash transfer schemes emerging, and that's, again, encouraging and shows that in every challenge there is an opportunity. Very quickly on some of the sectors, I think Yofi's mentioned it, transport, tourism, trade obviously have been the most largely impacted. You've got countries like the Gambia, half of its exports rely on the tourism industry. And so there's a lot of countries currently, and we're working with them to sort of do a study on reopening the tourism sector, what it would mean. Of course, natural resources, the dependency on natural resources has been affecting countries like Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Burkina Faso, and for those developing an agriculture and manufacturing base, as we've heard, access to inputs has been particularly problematic with the closing of borders. But we're also seeing, again, sort of opportunities. For instance, in the lack of medical equipment, we've seen a number of countries, Ghana, Senegal, in the region, Nigeria, turning to the domestic manufacturing base to produce medical equipment, reconverting, repurposing beverage companies into hand sanitizing factories, garment companies into masks, all the way down to Senegal partnering with a UK company and the French Research Institute about rapid diagnostic technology. So again, challenges, but also opportunities, and agro-processing and manufacturing being the most important. And another opportunity and impact here is also the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement. It's acted, it's happening. We expect some delayed implementation, disputed rules of origin negotiation, but overall, this is going to be very important in breaking down trade barriers. And I think COVID is really showing that countries more than ever have to look to create domestic and regional demand. In a way, this crisis is encouraging a trend towards industrialization. Many countries are currently rolling out economic recovery plans with support from development partners. This is an opportunity to have a conversation about having clear priority sectors, learning from global best practices. And I think in this regard, Israel has a lot to offer in terms of both the agile government policy as well as sort of innovation and technology from the private sector. And I think, as you've heard from Yofi, the West African government are really ready to engage and to facilitate partnership with foreign investors. We've seen that innovative policy, industrial parks being created, special economic zones. You've heard about Ghana's industrialization programs. Others have similar programs. So I think there's a real willingness to listen, to learn, to work together, and to move past this sort of crisis. Maybe I'll pause there. I know some of the follow-up questions include sort of lessons from Israel or what Israeli company can do, and what more specific opportunities exist. So maybe wait then.
Thank you very much, Mr. Haas. You definitely gave us some very good thinking materials and for questions for later. I would like to please continue with Mr. Efwa, representing the bank. As the chairman, we would like to hear and get to know you better. Unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. You can hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. I can.
Okay, thank you. Just checking. Good afternoon. My name is Edward Effa. I'm the chairman of Fidelity Bank. Fidelity Bank is a commercial bank in Accra. We're the fourth largest bank, and we bank quite a number of Israeli companies in Ghana. In mining sector, in construction, in cybersecurity and other areas. So we're here to support the Israeli business community interested in Ghana, and also Ghanaian businesses looking for partners in Israel. I agree with everything Mr. Yofi Grant has said in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the economy of Ghana, on trade, on industries, on supply chains, on livelihoods, the social impact, and the opportunities he outlined. I'd like to give maybe a slightly different perspective so that I don't repeat everything he said. But certainly everything he said in terms of the impact on GDP growth, the impact on the deficit, and so on and so forth, I concur with all of them. I would like to perhaps bring a different dimension in terms of the response of the private sector in Ghana, the impact on the banking sector to date, the industries which we see struggling with the repayment of their loans, and then I'll go into some of the areas where we see investment opportunities. Certainly from the point of view of the private sector, a number of industries have been impacted, but we also saw a very good response by the private sector in supporting government, which was perhaps unprecedented in many parts of the world. So I'm part of a group called, we set up the private sector, the COVID-19 Private Sector Fund, which aimed to raise 100 million cedis, that's about $18 million, to support the government efforts. And in the period of the lockdown, this private sector fund, of which I co-chair, fed over 150,000 people with hot meals, all of which was from private sector donations. We also provided 5,000 uncooked food to a number of deprived homes and areas, and each box of food could feed a family of 5 for a month. So this is uncooked rice, oil, sugar, and other items which went around. And for the first time, the private sector is building a public hospital in collaboration with the government. So we're more than halfway through building a 100-bed isolation and treatment center on government land, which we'll hand over to the government of Ghana immediately after it's complete. And we're more than halfway there, and it's planned that the hospital will be handed over to the government of Ghana by the end of the month of June. So we're seeing the private sector respond beyond beyond the usual sort of business activities, beyond the call of duty, to support government in a big way. We're also seeing, I think, Anthony mentioned it, a lot of private sector companies, many of whom are our customers, have converted the facility to support COVID. So we have a number of alcohol manufacturers who manufacture and distribute spirits. They're now all manufacturing sanitizers and alcoholic wipes and other health needs to support COVID. We're seeing a lot of our customers in the manufacturing of textiles now manufacturing face masks and protective gear and equipment for health care workers. And I think all this goes to show the sort of opportunities which we have in Ghana. We've had the commercial banks and the central bank respond to support the country and to breathe life into the economy. The central bank has amended the Bank of Ghana Act to allow the government of Ghana to borrow some 10 billion cedis to the government to help the government meet the deficit which has arisen as a result of COVID. The central bank has reduced the policy rate by 150 basis points to 14%. The commercial banks have worked together in a spirit of patriotism, which I wish we did all the time, to provide a syndicated facility to the government of Ghana. This is being looked at for a 3 billion cedi facility. The central bank reduced the primary rate so that the commercial banks will have more liquidity to support the SME sector. Interest rates have been reduced to SMEs by and large by some 2 percentage points, and so on and so forth. In addition, there are many other facilities. The government of Ghana has put together a 600 million facility for the National Board of Small Scale Industries. There's a COVID-19 alleviation program by the government of Ghana, and many other activities to try and support the economy of Ghana and the government of Ghana from coming out of the difficult situation. So there are many of these initiatives which are being implemented by the private sector to support the government. In addition, UFI referred to a number of government programs, 1D, One District, One Factory, which is looking at the processing of largely agri produce across the country, planting for food and jobs. And I think what COVID has shown is that we need to, that's perhaps for all African countries, to look at our internal economies and see how we work on the value chains instead of and reducing food importation and also processing as much as we can locally. So in all these areas, whether it's food imports, whether it's other areas of manufacturing where we import finished goods from outside, largely for local consumption, we're seeing more investment, we're seeing more opportunity for the gap to be closed. We're seeing more opportunity in healthcare. All of a sudden, I think the affluent Africans, whether it's Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, wherever, have realized they can't fly to Dubai or to London or to New York for medical care. Everybody has to stay in Ghana and work on the healthcare system. So there's a lot of interest in investing in the healthcare sector. The government is building 88 100-bed hospitals. So that's a huge investment in districts which don't have hospital facilities. And we're seeing a significant investment by the private sector in diagnostic facilities, in healthcare facilities, and in pharmaceutical manufacturing capability. Because of course, we have a customer who's manufacturing hydroxychloroquine and other pathogens which were not previously done in Ghana. So the private sector, I think, has responded very well. And we see a lot of opportunity in agriculture, where I think Israel has the capability and can bring agri technology to Ghana to help boost yields and to do interesting things in the agri space. We see a lot of companies now working online, more Zoom calls. We have conference calls every day. Lots of banks are offering digital banking, and this has improved the need for cybersecurity and other technology to support industries across Ghana. And this is an area where a number of Israeli companies have capabilities and can come and add value. We see a lot of opportunity, certainly in the pharmaceutical sector and the healthcare sector, in manufacturing as many of our own needs as possible, and to reduce the risk of having to import essential drugs from outside the country. So there's an investment opportunity here. In sanitation, there's a lot of investment opportunity. And lastly, in infrastructure and construction, where we bank a number of Israeli companies in the construction space. But again, there's opportunity in water and power, in developing infrastructure. So those are the different dimensions I like to bring from the point of view of the private sector and what the private sector is doing and responding to COVID in Ghana, to complement Ilfi's presentation on the impact on the economy at large and GDP and the different sectors of the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Effa. It is very interesting to hear the different perspectives from the government point of view and from the private sector point of view. And we will refer to it a little bit further later. I would like to invite Ayelet Levin-Karp, the Israeli Commercial Attaché in Ghana. We would love to hear from your point of view, how did you experience this past few months, and how do you see the bridge between Israel and Ghana being built and reconstructed?
So, hello everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Ayelet Levin-Karp, head of Trade Mission to Ghana, part of the network of 45 economic missions that the Ministry of Economy and Industry of Israel has around the world. It's important to mention in Africa for many years, we had only one economic mission in South Africa. And 2 years ago, about in 2018, I opened the trade mission in Ghana overlooking West Africa, and my colleague Arnon opened one in Kenya. So and this was part of a government resolution to enhance economic relationships with Africa. So since then, we are working in Ghana, looking to enhance economic relationships, which basically, I always say, like, you know, at the bottom of things, I'm a matchmaker. We really try to find and make as many interactions between Israeli and Ghanaian companies as possible. And we do that. We have, you know, so now I'm talking about pre-COVID-19, we have our ways of doing that, which a lot of them are doing seminars, meetups, trade missions, both from Ghana to Israel and from Israel to Ghana. We like to share and spread information, both in to the Ghanaian business community and to the Israeli business community, to because I think when because we are like in this, let's put it that way, there's much more potential in the Ghana, Israel, or West Africa, Israel business ties than we have now. I think a lot of it is also just about awareness and information, and just that's one of the bases of putting the economies closer. And of course, we also we provide scouting activities, both for Ghanaian and Israeli companies. And we also work on the G2G level and different economic agreements that will help the business flow. Now, I want to share a little bit of our focus sectors, because I think, again, these are the sectors generally we feel that the most potential in the, and a lot of them were already mentioned: agriculture, water and sanitation, cybersecurity, fintech, health, both digital health and medical equipment, mining, oil and gas, homeland security, and renewable energies. These are the main sectors that the mission focuses on, and most of our events are around. But of course, we help and support any initiative that seems suitable to us and of mutual beneficial for both countries. And now that brings me to what's happening now. So of course, not only that our way of promoting these ties changed, but actually the way of doing business, doing post I don't know if we're doing or post COVID-19. We're kind of doing definitely in Africa. I think we're definitely still in the middle of the event. The question is how we do that now. So the potential, I think it's interesting because I made a few points of what are the areas where I think there's the most potential, and they were said by the previous panelists. There's a lot of potential, especially during COVID-19, in agriculture and health and different digitalization, fintech, cyber. We see a lot of interest in cyber because of the fast digitalization that the economy is going through. But for me, the real question and what I'm thinking about a lot is how we bridge the physical gap, since the borders in Ghana are closed already for more than 2 months, and it's also in other West African countries. One of the first things that happened was that the countries decided to close the border for a movement of people. For commodities still flow actually quite well, but as far as the way that business is done in Africa and in Ghana, it's a lot through interactions, personal interactions. The need, and it's not only in Ghana. I don't think it's something special, but it is very, very strong in the culture to have this strong relationship before you go to business and see the things in your eyes. And now it's all kind of becoming digital, and that is one aspect. And the other aspect is that since we have all those macroeconomic effects that were also already spoken about, the feeling, at least in the private sector, is that there's also times of uncertainty. So people are a little bit more hesitant about making investment, going and closing the deal. And in that sense, that is the main challenges I see. Our way of dealing with it, and these are I'm just going to give 2 tips, because I think I see that the time is short, and I would like also to open it for more questions for the panelists. But I think for the Israeli companies, mostly and it's also relevant for this time, but also in general, to be willing to start small, to do a pilot project, to show what's your offer to the market. I feel like a lot of times when Israeli companies are looking to come into the Ghanaian or the African market, they feel like if they're going so far, it should be worth their while. It should be something big. And there is opportunity for big projects and big investments in Ghana and West Africa, like mentioned. But I feel like sometimes just the idea of starting small, showing what you need, what's your added value, finding a good local partner to work with that believed in the project because he saw how it works. Of course, keeping everything, your offer very affordable, simple, and modular, so it could add up, and you could start with a small kit or whatever of your solution that can add up and become bigger. Things like that I think are very important when you come into the Ghanaian market, especially these days. And it's something to be considered. And of course, we are here as a digital physical bridge between the economies, and always open for ideas, and trying to bridge that gap and make the connections also these days.
Mute. Then I can listen. But I can't hear.
Very much, Ayelet. I would like to get back to Mr. Grant and dig a little bit deeper in our discussion and some of the things that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the goal of building resilience in Ghana and encouraging domestic consumption. And I would like to connect your statement with some of the challenges that were mentioned by the panelists, like the disability to meet face-to-face and the lockdowns. And
so if I want to go out to do some work, I can lower this way.
Mm-hmm. No, please mute your microphone if you are not speaking. Thank you. And all the different challenges that the COVID-19 made us face. So from your point of view, first of all, I'd like to hear what do you see as the main challenge, and how do you think we can overcome it?
That's a big question, because this challenge is global. And of course, there are two immediate things. First is preserve lives. So that means getting ahead of the virus. And this must also be a global consensus, whether any vaccine will be developed or whether herd immunity is going to develop. The important thing is to save lives. And so for many of us, the thing is, how do we shore up our medical services and our health provision services such that they can give quality care? And I dare say that that's one area that so far Africa and West Africa has been behind the race in the infrastructure. But in Ghana, as Edward said, I think the private sector has stepped out quite creditably and assisting government to ensure that we do have that robust infrastructure. Indeed, as I speak, 88 hospitals are being built in Ghana almost simultaneously, in addition to some other regional hospitals and health centers. And so we believe that we'll be better prepared. So saving lives is important. We still continue to test, trace, and treat, or test, track, and treat to ensure that we keep down the numbers and with quarantine, etc. So that's one. The other one is preserving livelihoods, and that's where the big challenge comes, because that is where you want to either reboot the economy or resuscitate an economy that has gone down, and how do you get people back to work? So some of the restrictions had to be eased because, as was said before, sometimes the cure might be more deadly than the disease. And in trying to prevent people from getting ill and you lock down the economy, the whole country suffers, particularly in Africa, where we, like I did say, we are very communal and most of our enterprises are small and medium sized. So it's been important in at some point opening up such that we can get some of those value chains in agriculture and manufacturing going. As Edward said, the local industry has taken over some of the PPE that elsewhere we might have imported. So we are doing face masks, we are doing coveralls, we are doing alcohol and sanitizers, and looking forward to do other things. I mean, there are even local people trying to do ventilators. I mean, create their own ventilators that can be used by the health services. So livelihoods are the next most important challenge to preserve and getting the economy back. And government has put in quite a significant number of initiatives to try and make sure that the road back to a normal economy will be as smooth as possible. Because as it is right now, in keeping both sides, the lives and the livelihood, there has been a significant negative impact on the economy because now government has to spend where it hadn't planned to spend. Secondly, revenues have been cut short significantly, but there's hardly any trade. FDI has been curtailed. The financial sector has been disrupted somewhat. And as Edward indicated, some are actually doing interest cutbacks, etc., to help people who cannot pay to have some relief. Real estate, there's been job losses, high overhead costs, salary cuts, and all these things the government is expected to supplement. Of course, transportation, because when there was a lockdown, there was hardly any movement, so owners of transportation have been virtually brought to a standstill. Businesses have made significant losses as consumption has also decreased, and there are high operational costs out of COVID-19. Households themselves have suffered through the people not working and therefore now getting lower disposable incomes. The job losses, significant job losses, agriculture, limiting farmers and farms access to inputs. So it's going to affect that. That's also going to affect agriculture exports in the long run. And so the challenges are many. The challenges are many and they are diverse. But the important thing is that we need to have a post-COVID recovery plan. What we've done in Ghana is to set up an interministerial committee in addition to the COVID-19 committee assisting the president. Now, the interministerial committee its main purpose is to plan how to respond to COVID-19 and look at the recovery post-COVID-19. It gives us a great opportunity in the short term, medium term, and the long term strategy towards irreversible and sustainable growth. And so for us, that's a good thing. And we've come out with some very interesting proposals. As Edward mentioned, how do we now encourage and incentivize the local industries to take over import substitution? And we started with the PPEs, but it looks like there is an overwhelming agreement that perhaps the best way is to look inwards. And the AFCFTA provides a great market and impetus for anybody to do that. So it will be an interesting place to get partnerships from Israel, as Edward said. Indeed, if you look at the total spend from government, it's in the region of 19 billion Ghana cedis. And if you divide that by 6, maybe some $3 billion that the government is going to spend to overcome these challenges. There's a lower cap on what we call the stabilization fund, which was set up in budget from $300 million to $100 million, and the transfer of the $200 million into what we call the contingency fund called the Corona Alleviation Program, the CAP 1. So that is going to be funded by 200 million, and it will augment what Edward also said about distributing hot food and distributing cold food to people, and making sure that you control, at least you save lives that have not even been affected by the disease. Apart from building the medical centers and increasing the number of test centers from the original 2 to 10, and probably now we'll go further up to be able to test quicker, get the results quicker, isolate quicker, and give treatment quicker. Then, of course, there's the IMF. We actually applied to the IMF Rapid Credit Facility, another almost $100 million. And then we also applied to the World Bank for the Development Policy, what they call the DPO facility, of another $500 million. And then AFDB also put in some $80 million thereabouts. And then we got, as Edward said, we got relief funding from the central bank lending to the Ministry of Finance, that's 10 billion cedis. All of that comes to about 19 billion, 400 million cedis of support to the economy, first to save lives and then to preserve livelihoods and better prepare us going forward.
I'm going to break in for a second. This is Janet. I'm going to break in for a second to remind everybody we're at the top of the hour. We also have breakout rooms that we're going to be doing. We'll be carrying on for another few minutes with this main session. We encourage everyone, you can write questions in the chat box if you have questions for the panel. And as we're getting a little bit close to time, we're going to ask the panelists to try to keep your answers sort of short so we can get through a few more questions. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I would like to address our next question to Mr. Huss. Since we have almost 100 companies from Israel listening to us right now, how would you take all this information and all the various partnerships that are happening in Africa and the investments that are happening internally to the practical level of a company that is interested to operate in West Africa? What would you advise them for their next steps? What should they consider in their strategy?
Thanks for the question. In our experience, I guess the two success factors here are sort of government leadership and then de-risking for the private sector. Government leadership is obviously very important because that's the rule of the game, that's sort of the incentives, that's beyond that, it's also sort of the day-to-day follow-up. And I think some of the government to government sort of collaboration that Ayelet was mentioning earlier is very, very important. And in this regard, Israel, both the public and the private sector have a lot to share with Africa. We worked with the Volcani International Partnership to do a case study on how Israel became a world leader in the agriculture and water management sector. I think there's a lot there to learn. Obviously, some countries are already sort of seizing the leadership moment, and you've heard loud and clear from Ghana that they are really on top of their games. It's about effective policy management, sort of, and really being market driven. So government realizing that, you know, it's come from the private sector. And in terms of the private sector, I mean, obviously, Israeli companies have so much to offer. They're inventive, they're market focused, data driven. A lot of R&D has gone into ag tech, and I think that Africa is having an ag tech moment. So the conflation of opportunities and interest could not be obvious. I mean, in our experience, is really about, first of all, the sort of the information gap. I'm sure here in the audience, there is virtual audience. There's a lot of people who are familiar with the region. But if you take a sort of a 10,000 feet perspective, West Africa is still not very well known. And there's different currencies, different political systems in the context of a regional trade at the same time. So it's both sort of confusing and actually easy. So there's a bit of an information gap that first needs to be addressed. And this kind of initiative today is very important to address that. And then it's sort of the day-to-day follow-up, and I'm sure Yofi would agree in that. I'm sure that's sort of the marching order he's giving to all of his teams, is that, you know, having account managers that are developing a personal relationship with the different companies to provide information, welcome them at the airport, show them around across all the ministries, and one gap often is sort of interministerial collaboration, and agencies like the Ghana Investment Promotion Center is exactly filling that gap. And then once people leave, it's about following up and having high standards, the same you'd expect from law firms in Israel, about making sure your email is responded within X day or X hours, and that with the right information, well presented and packaged. And then there are sort of opportunities like the Agriculture Green Alliance Forum, which Ghana hosted last year, and we also worked with the Israeli diplomatic mission to host a delegation of Israeli businesses, and it's about organizing meeting and doing the right sort of follow-up. And I mean, finally, I'll say that it's also about having bankable projects and making sure that we have the right financing instruments, and that people have a good understanding of the fiscal constraints that government can have about providing guarantees or not, and work with the right sort of banks. And we've heard today from a bank in the region that the region has actually a number of banks that are willing to provide de-risking facilities for the private sector.
Thank you very much. To make best use of our time, I will address the next question to Mr. Effa, a question from the audience. But before that question, I see that we have Guy Feldman here, former ambassador to Nigeria and the ECOWAS, so welcome, glad that you joined. So my question is from Ellie. He's asking about financial for agricultural projects with smallholder and big farmers in Ghana, from the government, from the bank. I will take his question a little bit to the macro level and ask, what would you advise regarding finance of projects in Ghana in collaboration with the private sector, the Ghanaian private sector? Put your microphone on.
Sorry.
I'm copying Yofi Grant. No, thank you. I'd like to say that, generally speaking, there is more money available than bankable projects amongst the banks. And we often hear the banks are not supportive and so on and so forth. But we have over 20 well-capitalized banks, all of whom have a lot of liquidity. So the issue isn't the availability of funding, but the issue is the availability of bankable projects. And I'm yet to come across any good project which has got an experienced management team, they've got a track record, they've got the technology, and so on and so forth, and the business model is viable, and they can't find funding. So I think any investor coming to the market should certainly do a thorough feasibility, understand the market, and sometimes it also depends on your strategy in entering the market. I'll give you an example. We financed a cement manufacturer who came to Ghana recently. Before they came into Ghana, for 2 years, before they put up the plant in Ghana, they were importing and distributing in Ghana. So when they say they want to fund the manufacturing and they'll have the capacity to sell this amount into the market, it's not disputable because they're already doing it. So in the same way, I think Ayelet said in the beginning, it's good to come in, do a pilot, develop it, test the market, as opposed to come in and raise a lot of funding for one big project on day one. So there are different ways to approaching the market. There is certainly a lot of funding. I don't know of any manufacturing project which is viable, which cannot find funding. Agric can be a bit more tricky if there is no irrigation plan, and therefore there's a risk of relying on seasonality of rains and prayers for rain. But I think once we know of agric projects which have de-risked using technology, using what do you call them, the houses where they grow foodstuff in, and all the rest of it, and they found the funding. So by and large, I think it depends on your project, it depends on the team, it depends on the track record and experience of the company. But if all those boxes are ticked, and of course, it depends on how much equity you have as well. And it helps to have some equity to start the project, and the bank comes on lend. And the more, the less equity and the more debt you take, the more risky it is, and therefore the more difficult to get. But by and large, I think Ghana today is a very different place from Ghana 20, 25 years ago, when access to capital was difficult. I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, thank you very much. So at this point, we would like to continue to the various rooms that we have allocated in the past hour. We're going to have 3 different topics that we will continue to discuss. So before we finish, I would like to thank very much to our panelists for dedicating the time and sharing your knowledge with us. It definitely gave us a lot of things to think about, and you guys should look forward to all the different follow-up emails from the various people who participated in this webinar. So Mr. Grant, thank you very much. Mr. Huss, thank you very much. And Mr. Afwat, thank you. Ayelet, thank you as well. We will continue to different rooms. Right now, you should have a button on your screen that gives you the opportunity to join one of the breakout rooms. If you click the button join, you will be able to join the room. You should have been assigned to one of the rooms, and if you haven't, you will be assigned right now. I would like to say thank you to all the participants that have joined us so far. My name is Noah. I represent the Emerging Markets and Financial Institutions Department at the Foreign Trade Administration, Ministry of Economy. I was happy to be with you. You guys are welcome to join the various rooms right now.
Just a quick explanation. Whoever was not assigned, whoever doesn't have a join button on the bottom of his Zoom, please stay in the main room and tell me which group would you like to be assigned to.
Unfortunately, I have time limitations. So I might have to run as I'm going into another webinar. I'm doing quite almost a similar thing, but in the UK. So I'd like to say a big thank you, first of all, for participating and for all those who took time to be on this webinar. I keep saying that Ghana is ready. Ghana, we are keenly excited about the future. We know this one too shall pass and we'll get back our lives, and we'll keep telling you that we still remain attractive and we still remain committed to engaging with foreign investors. The Ghana story I call the 3 O's: opportunity, openness, and optimism. And we stick to that maxim, and we welcome you all. So thank you very much for listening. And if I go off, it's because I have to join another webinar. It's by no means saying that this is not as important anyway. So thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody.